Okay, this is a follow-up video to the RunPod running video. If you haven't seen the RunPod explanation video, the startup video for that, I suggest go watch that first. Or if you're already familiar with how to run this on a Jupyter Notebook on any sort of cloud instance, this video will cover how to actually tweak your training settings. So I've already launched a training session in RunPod, and so we're already set here. I've already uploaded my images, and I'm sitting here ready to go. So really the thing I'm going to jump right into is just looking at the settings on the actual cell that runs your training, and also the train.json here that it is based off of. So when you run one of the container repos using Train Jupyter Lab Notebook, this is the default cell that runs, and what it does is it first reads the train.json to get a whole bunch of default values for training settings. It sets the checkpoint, the base model that you're going to use, which we're getting this off of Hugging Face, off of Panopster / Everydream, which is a copy of the Stable Diffusion 1.5 with the improved VAE. We've got a project name, data root, which is just pointing to the input folder over here, and that's where we put our images. It's the easiest way to get started. How many epochs you're going to run, how often you want training samples, right? How many steps between training samples. So 150 is fairly often. 200 epochs is quite a lot. If you have just a few images, that's good. If you have lots of images, you probably need fewer than that. And then how often you want to save, and this is how, for every 35 epochs out of the 200 total, we're going to save a checkpoint. Our learning rate, which we're setting to 1.2 to -6, and learning rate schedule we just stick with constant for the defaults, and then this is actually setting to save a full 4 GB floating point 32 checkpoint instead of the pruned floating point 16 if you want that. So this is basically how it's set up by default. If you wanted to train your learning rate, you can actually just do it here. That's pretty common. Maybe we can say that I don't really need sample steps as often, so I can change that to 300. And I also, if I had 1,000 images, or in this case I think I have 170, with 170 I know that this training is actually only going to take about 40 epochs, and then since I'm only doing 40, I'll set to save that every 10, and that means I'll get 3 epochs. I'll get 10, 20, 30, and then the final one at 40. If you want to get more complicated with that and you want to change more than it's here, since we're using the train.json as a base, you can go over here to train.json, right click, and we're going to want to open with here. Use the open with. In this flyout, we want to choose editor. If you just click this, you will get a view, but you can't edit the file here, so we don't want to do that. What we actually want to do is right click and then go open with editor, and this opens up an editor with syntax highlighting, and we can actually modify the defaults here. Since some of these things are being overridden here, we don't need to change them. If you wanted to, you could actually delete all this and set everything in train.json if you wanted. For the sake of this tutorial, I will leave these here. And for instance, data root is set to input folder, which is where I'm putting my images over here on the left. And if I look at train.json, the default data root is set to x:/ blah blah blah, but that is getting overridden by the setting here on the start cell. But let's say that I want to change my learning rate to cosine. I can go in here and change that to cosine. Actually, I take that back. That's being set here. So I can actually delete LR scheduler constant. If I delete it from here, it's actually going to then take the LR scheduler from the train.json. So now I've switched it to cosine. You could also instead, if you wanted, change it to cosine here. But there are things that are not listed here that are in train.json that you might want to tweak. So let's say that we want to turn validation on. Currently, validation is not turned on by default. That may change in the future. I may decide that that's going to be added. We can actually change that. We can actually add a new setting in here, and I will actually add this to the repo so it's on. But we're going to add validation config, and we're going to say that we want to use the validation default.json, and this is going to turn on validation. And we can also then look at the validation default. I will also open that in an editor, and you can see now, since I've set validation config to validation default, it's going to load the validation stuff, the validation config from this file. And you can see here that this is going to turn on. You can read through this documentation. I'm not going to go over the details of validation. That will be out of scope for this video, but you can see that now it's going to turn on validation. It's going to do an automatic split, and it's going to take 15% of our training data for validation, and we will not use stabilized training, which is another loss we can track. And we'll run validation every epoch. We will use the seed of 555 for validation. This doesn't really matter, you just need something. And I will not use the relative loss pattern. If you want more details on this specifically on validation, I probably will do another video on it, or you can read on the up on the validation on the main Every Dream repo. Let's see what else we can change. We can turn on weights and biases. So if we turn on weights and biases here, we just set that to wand B to true. What this is going to do is actually not only log to the tensor board here on our RunPod instance, but it's also going to log to our weights and balances account. And when you start up training, what it will do is actually prompt you for your API key. You'll paste your API key and hit enter, and then you'll get a permanent copy of your logs on your weights and biases account. So that's something that's kind of useful to use. If you do that, you can also give the weights and biases a run name. Run name is used on weights and biases along with project name. Project name plus run name are used there. So you could say this is my 1E, 1.2E -6 test of Cloud Strife, or whatever you want, you can put in there. A couple other things you could do is if you for some reason wanted to save your checkpoint somewhere else, you could change that. You can turn off gradient checkpointing. We can turn that off because we don't need it on a 3090. We can set that to false. You can change your batch size. Let's say that we're going to change, well, this is a 24 gig 3090 instance. We are training at 512 resolution, and we are using the Stable Diffusion 1.5 a base model, so 512 resolution. Batch size 10 is actually good. AMP is actually defaulted to on anyway. We don't need to worry about that. But really this is just to show you kind of how to modify the train.json. All of these settings in here are all covered in the documentation, so I would recommend you kind of go through the tweaking guide on Every Dream, and I will actually bring that up really quick. If we look at the repo, you can start looking through basic tweaking. This will explain what project name is, use Atom 8-bit, which is actually defaulted on now, changing your resolution, checkpoints. You can save your checkpoints. You can set the save every n minutes. So anything that you see here documented, resume checkpoint, batch size, sample prompts, and then also we can click on the advanced tweaking. You can see there's even more stuff in here you can mess with if you want. You can turn a clip skip on, is in here. If you want to use clip skip, you can set clip skip. Generally for Stable Diffusion 1.5, you'd use 0. If you're training on Stable Diffusion 2. anything else, you may decide that you want to use clip skip 2, which would be the canonical penultimate layer clip skip training. There's some information on LR schedulers here, and you can tweak warm-up and decay steps if you're using something like cosine. That is exposed here. If we look at LR decay steps, LR warm-up steps. So I just, again, really, I think I'll kind of cut the video short here. I'm mainly just trying to show you that anything that's in this train.json and also these parameters here in the startup, all those are going to be documented here. Grad accumulation, all that kind of fun stuff. Flip, seed, shuffle tags, zero frequency noise, that's offset, also known as offset noise, that's also set in train.json. It's defaulted to just 2%. It's a pretty small amount. The blog post used 10%. I found that to sometimes be too high, so I set it to a safer low value. And then you can also, again, read through all these if you really want. on the basic tweaking and advanced tweaking, and then you can then go in here and paste them in to the train.json. So that's pretty much it. So you can change all your train.json settings here. If you want, you could edit these locally using something like Notepad++ or VS Code. You can copy this train.json locally to your own computer and edit it and then just upload it. You can copy this train.json. For instance, if you had your own custom train.json and you wanted to use that instead, you could upload my train dot my training whatever Final Fantasy, and you made a custom one of these JSON files. You can just upload that and use that, and you could even delete all this if you wanted to put everything in train.json and not override anything. That will work. So I think I will cut this video short as I start to ramble. That is the basics of getting into advanced tweaking. You want to get familiar with this file. You'll also see that syntax highlighting there's some syntax highlighting, but make sure you have a comma at the end, and any path names need to either be double backslash or single forward slash is also acceptable. So there it is with single forward slashes. Not going to be a big deal on RunPod because you'll just use data root input here or data root input here if you don't overwrite it with the startup cell and just put your files into input. That's the easiest way. But that's pretty much it. I would recommend, if you're interested in getting a little bit more advanced, that you do get familiar with this train.json file and you get familiar with going in here with right click, open with editor, and then use this editor here to tweak your settings. That's it for now. I will follow up with some more videos, maybe on some more specifics on these advanced settings at a later date. Thanks.